The heat was heavy that afternoon, the kind that stuck to your skin and made everything feel slower. Jamal Rivers sat in his rented car, parked just across the street from a place he hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades. Larson's Cafe, same old bricks, same chipped green awning. The windows were smudged, the paint on the door frame flaking, and yet it looked almost exactly how he remembered it. He wasn't sure why he came. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe something deeper, a pull from a place he'd buried long ago. He took a breath, stared at his reflection in the car window. He looked different now, clean-shaven, tailored button-up, watch that said, "I made it." But still, in the back of his mind, that small voice whispered, "They'll never really see you that way here." He stepped out and crossed the street. His shoes tapped against the hot sidewalk, steady, certain. But when he reached the door, he hesitated. For a second, he thought of his grandmother, the way her hand used to gently push the small of his back, urging him forward when he was too shy to walk in. Back then, he was just a boy looking for pancakes and sweet tea. Now, he was here for something else. The door creaked open, and the bell overhead gave a tired jingle. Inside, it smelled like fried onions and old coffee. A few customers turned their heads, then turned back again, too quickly. Conversations quieted. Jamal's eyes scanned the room. A row of booths lined the left side, bar stools on the right. The place had aged but not grown. Behind the counter stood a man wiping his hands on a ragged white towel. Doug Larson. Thicker, now than he was when Jamal last saw him, but with the same narrow eyes and tight mouth. Jamal offered a polite nod. "Afternoon," he said, his voice even. Doug stared at him for a moment too long, then turned to grab a coffee pot. "We're closing soon." Jamal glanced at the clock. It was 3:12. The open sign still blinked faintly in the window. "Didn't realize. I'll be quick." A man in a flannel shirt, seated at the counter, snorted under his breath. "You. People never are." Jamal froze. The words were quiet but sharp, like a slap in a silent room. He looked at the man, mid-60s maybe, face like worn leather. He didn't even bother to look up, just kept stirring his coffee. Doug didn't say a word, didn't apologize, didn't correct him. Just poured the coffee and slid it across the counter to someone else. Jamal cleared his throat, trying to ignore the burn in his chest. "I'm not here to eat," he said slowly. "I wanted to ask about the place, the cafe. I heard it might be for sale." That got Doug's attention. He finally looked Jamal in the eye, the towel now balled tightly in his hand. "Who told you that? Does it matter?" Doug stepped out from behind the counter, his boots thudding against the old wooden floor. "Look, I don't know who you are or what you heard, but this place ain't for sale." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "Really? The real estate listing said otherwise." Doug's jaw tensed. "You must have read it wrong." Another silence fell. It was thick, uneasy. Jamal could feel the stares. He wasn't welcome here. Not as a customer, and certainly not as a potential buyer. He nodded slowly, biting back the anger. "Right, must have been a mistake." He turned to leave, his steps slower now. As he reached the door, the man in flannel finally looked up. "Should have stayed in Atlanta." Jamal paused. He didn't turn around. He didn't speak, but his fingers curled tightly around the door frame before he pushed it open and stepped back into the sunlight. Outside, the town looked just the same, quiet, clean, smiling on the surface. But inside, something in him had cracked open. He hadn't expected a red carpet, but he hadn't expected that either. And now, as he walked back to his car, the familiar ache returned. That same one he'd carried as a boy when they wouldn't serve his grandmother inside, only through the back door. The same ache he thought he'd outgrown with his degrees and business cards and city address. But here, none of that mattered. Here, he was still just another you people. He slid into the driver's seat, shut the door gently, and stared at the diner through the windshield. He should drive away, he should leave this town behind again. But the thing about pain, it doesn't always break you. Sometimes, it plants something, a seed, And in that moment, Jamal knew he wasn't done with Larson's cafe. Not yet. Jamal didn't sleep much that night. He sat at the edge of the guest bed in his mother's house, staring at the dim ceiling fan as it spun, slow and quiet. The house still smelled like lavender and lemon oil, just like when he was a boy. But the comfort of home felt distant now, swallowed by the sharpness of that afternoon. The words echoed in his head. "You people never are." Should have stayed in Atlanta. He had spent years trying to forget how it felt. The looks, the doors that closed before he even knocked. The sting of being tolerated, never truly accepted. And just when he thought he'd shed that weight, one trip back home dropped it all right on his chest again. The next morning, Jamal rose early, hoping to push it aside. He went for a run, hoping the rhythm of his breath and the beat of his shoes might drown out the memory. But the anger followed him, heavy with each step. Later that day, he found himself back in town. Not by accident. Something had pulled him. Not to Larson's this time, but to the city records office. He needed to know if the cafe was really listed for sale or if Doug had just lied to his face. The clerk, a kind middle-aged woman with graying curls, tapped away at her keyboard and gave him a puzzled look. Actually, yes, it went up on the internal system a week ago. Owner's behind on property taxes, too. Would you like the listing agent's contact? Jamal's chest tightened, not out of surprise, but out of confirmation. Doug had lied, and he lied with the same confidence that only comes from knowing you can get away with it. Jamal took the card she handed him, thanked her, and walked out with a cold, quiet determination. But fate has a way of spinning stories before you're ready. That same afternoon, as Jamal walked out of the local hardware store, a white police officer stood beside his car. Lean, young and barely shaving, the officer had one hand on his belt, the other resting on the hood. "Is this your vehicle?" he asked without a greeting. Jamal blinked. "Excuse me?" I said, "Is this your car?" "It is." "Why?" The officer tilted his head slightly. "Got a call from someone at Larson's cafe about a suspicious man casing the area. Matched your description." Jamal laughed under his breath, not because it was funny, but because it was all too familiar. "So now asking about a real estate listing is casing the joint?" The officer didn't laugh. He kept his stance. "Just doing my job, sir. Can I see some ID?" Jamal pulled out his wallet slowly, calmly. He knew the dance. He handed over his license without a word. The officer looked it over, then gave it back. "You from around here?" "I grew up here. Left, though. Came back," Jamal replied coolly. "Is that a problem?" The officer shifted slightly. "No problem. Just maybe be mindful. Where you go asking questions. People around here are a little old-fashioned." Jamal stepped forward, locking eyes with him. Old-fashioned is one word for it. There was a long pause, the air between them thick with everything unspoken. Then the officer gave a tight nod and walked off. Jamal stood there, the card from the records office still in his pocket. His hand clenched around it now, not from fear but from fire. This wasn't just about pancakes and property taxes anymore. This was about the lie they told with their smiles, the truth they buried under their kindness, the belief that someone like him had no place asking questions, let alone owning anything. As he got into his car, he glanced back at the street corner where Larson stood, still pretending to be just another small-town cafe. It had shown him its teeth. Now he had to decide, was he going to walk away again, or was this time different? He turned the engine key slowly, and in that soft hum, a choice was forming. Not yet. He wasn't finished. The sun had dipped low by the time Jamal pulled into the driveway of his mother's house. The porch light flickered on automatically, casting a warm glow on the steps he used to race up as a kid. But now, every step felt heavier. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. His mother, Denise Rivers, sat at the kitchen table, slowly folding laundry with the news murmuring in the background. Her hair had more gray than he remembered. Her fingers moved gently, almost absent-mindedly, over the soft cotton. "You're late," she said without looking up. Jamal dropped his keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, the clink louder than expected. "I needed a drive." Denise raised, her eyes to him, something unspoken already forming on her lips. She could always tell when something wasn't right. It was in his shoulders, the silence in his footsteps. "What happened?" He sat across from her, leaning back in the chair. "I went by Larson's cafe." Her hand stopped folding. Jamal continued. "Place is falling apart. Doug still runs it like it's 1965. They pretended they were closing just to keep me from sitting down. Then some man at the counter made sure I knew I wasn't welcome, and Doug didn't even blink." Denise exhaled slowly, a sound heavy with years of knowing. "That place never changed," she said softly. "Not since your grandmama was alive. She used to walk the long way just to avoid that corner." Jamal looked down, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know why I thought it would be different." "Because you believed in progress," she said. "That's not a weakness, baby. That's your strength." But he didn't feel strong, not after being treated like a threat in his own hometown. Not after being questioned by a cop for daring to ask about a building. "I thought maybe if I bought it, fixed it up, turned it into something the community could be proud of." His words trailed off, bitterness creeping in. "But they made it clear I'm not part of that community. Not really." Denise reached across the table, her hand finding his. "They can't take your roots, Jamal. Doesn't matter how deep their hatred goes. Ours go deeper." He didn't speak. He just let her hand sit in his, the silence stretching between them. Later that night, unable to sleep, Jamal found himself in the attic. It had been years since he'd climbed those old steps. The boxes smelled like dust and memory. He moved aside a stack marked Grandma's things and opened the lid. Inside were photos, a few of her old recipe cards, her church fan with the cracked handle. And tucked inside a worn envelope was a letter, folded in half and yellowed at the edges. It was addressed to him, dated just after his high school graduation. "Jamal, if you're reading this, it means you came home. And that tells me you're still fighting for something bigger than yourself. I know this town hurt you. It hurt me too. But don't let that hurt turn your heart bitter. They want us silent. They want us small. But you, my boy, you were never meant to shrink. You were born to build. One day you'll walk into a room and make them remember who we are." Jamal sat back, tears threatening but not falling. His grandmother had always seen something in him, something he wasn't sure still existed. He looked at the letter again. "You were born to build, not run, not retreat, build." The weight in his chest shifted. Not gone, but changing shape. Maybe he didn't need their permission to belong. Maybe ownership wasn't just about real estate. It was about reclaiming space that had always tried to push him out. He folded the letter gently and placed it back, in the envelope as if sealing a promise. Tomorrow, he would call that agent. And this time, he wouldn't ask permission. The next day began with the kind of stillness Jamal had forgotten this town carried. Slow mornings, familiar streets, and a silence that felt less like peace and more like avoidance. He stepped out wearing confidence, like armor. Crisp shirt, clean shave, posture that said he belonged anywhere he walked. He wasn't going in for a meal today. He was going in with intent. He crossed Main Street like he had every right to be there. And he did. That was the point. The diner door creaked open again. That same dull bell gave a lazy ring. This time, no one turned to greet him. Doug Larson stood behind the counter with a newspaper in hand, glasses sliding down his nose. He looked up. The same blank expression. No recognition, no warmth. Just the kind of stare that made you feel like an inconvenience. Jamal approached the counter calmly. "I wanted to talk to you about the place," he said, his voice steady. Doug didn't respond immediately. He folded the newspaper carefully, then set it down. "Like I said yesterday, we're not looking to sell." Jamal tilted his head. "The tax office says otherwise." Doug's jaw tensed. "They shouldn't have told you that." "Maybe not," Jamal said, "but they did." Doug leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Look, I don't care what you think you can do with this place. This cafe's been part of this town longer than you've been alive. Jamal nodded. Exactly why I'm interested. You don't get it, do you? Doug's tone hardened. We don't need some outsider walking in here trying to make a name for himself. This isn't Atlanta. Jamal felt the heat rise in his chest, but he kept his tone measured. I'm not an outsider. I was born right here, went to school here, ate at this place every week with my grandmother. Doug smirked, shaking his head. Then you should remember how things work around here. A silence hung thick between them. Jamal looked around. Half the tables were full. Customers eating, sipping coffee, reading the paper. No one else was being turned away. He turned back to Doug. Are you open or not? Doug glanced at the clock. Closing early today. It's 11:15. Doug stepped away from the counter and grabbed a rag, wiping down an already clean table. Still closing. A voice from one of the booths cut through the air. An older man with a loud voice and a heavy drawl. Ain't you got anywhere else to be, boy? Jamal's breath caught in his throat. The man wasn't looking at him, just stirring his coffee slow, like his words weren't meant to hurt, just to warn. People like you always looking to stir things up, the man added without looking up. Why don't you just leave things the way they are? Jamal turned his head, eyes meeting the man's. For a second, the room felt smaller, tighter. The noise in the background dulled to nothing. He didn't respond. There was no point. He turned. Back to Doug. You don't want my money, fine, Jamal said quietly. But don't pretend this place is something sacred, when all it ever did was close its doors to people like me. Doug didn't blink. I don't owe you anything. Jamal stepped back, swallowing the lump in his throat. No, you don't. But this town does. And with that, he turned and walked out. The bell rang again, flat and cold. The air outside felt thick, heavier than when he walked in. As he stood on the sidewalk, something inside him twisted, not just from what had been said, but because none of it surprised him. That made it worse. The predictability of it. The way racism here didn't yell anymore. It whispered. It hid behind clocks and polite shrugs and closing early. He stood, still, staring at the cafe's window. The same window he used to peek through as a kid, hoping they'd let them sit inside that day. He remembered holding his grandmother's hand. He remembered her hopeful smile, the way she always wore her Sunday dress on Fridays, as if showing dignity would force respect. He remembered the day she told him, "One day, baby, you'll walk into places like this, and they'll be proud to serve you." But that day hadn't come, not yet, not here, not for him. Jamal clenched his jaw. The shame sat like a stone in his chest, but beneath it, anger, clean and sharp. He walked back to his car, heart pounding. As he opened the door, he said it under his breath. A whisper. A vow. I'll never step foot in that place again. But something deep inside him, something louder, was already disagreeing. The drive back to his mother's house was quiet, but his thoughts were anything but. He gripped the steering wheel tighter than he meant to. Each turn of the road seemed to wind through memory. The schoolyard where he first heard the N-word hurled like a rock. The library where the clerk used to watch him like he might steal the furniture. The barbershop that had been boarded up for years. Once the only place in town where he felt seen. This town didn't just ignore people like him, it erased them. By the time he pulled into the driveway, his chest was tight and his jaw ached from clenching. He sat in the car for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. His mother was in the garden kneeling near the hydrangeas. She wore a sun hat and loose cotton gloves, her movement slow but sure. She looked up when he stepped out, but didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She could read the storm in his face. He stood at the edge of the porch, hands in his pockets, trying to find the right words, but they came out sharp, unfiltered. They said they were closing at 11 in the morning. Place was half full. His mother stood up slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. I take it you went back to Larson's? Jamal nodded. She sighed. Not disappointed, just tired. You shouldn't be surprised, she said, walking past him toward the porch. That place never opened its doors to us. Not then. Not now. I know, he said. I just thought. She turned. To him. You thought you could change their minds. No, Jamal replied, his voice quieter now. I thought I didn't care anymore. She sat down on the top step. But you do. He didn't answer. He just sat beside her, the two of them facing the same small yard he used to run through barefoot in summer. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then she said, When you were little, your grandmother used to take you there every week. You remember that? He nodded slowly. I remember the pancakes. She smiled faintly. She made sure you never saw her flinch. But I remember. I remember the way they'd make her wait out back, the way they'd call her Miss Ruth to her face, but that colored woman as soon as she walked out. Jamal swallowed hard. She believed in claiming space, his mother continued. She didn't go there hoping they'd change. She went so you'd see her standing tall in places built to make her feel small. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. I felt like a kid again, he whispered. Powerless. Embarrassed. I just stood there and took it. No, baby, you walked out. I walked out humiliated. No, she said again, firmer this time. You walked out with your dignity. Jamal looked at her. Then why does it feel like I lost something? Because you remembered how much it hurt, she replied. And that's not weakness. That's proof you still care. He breathed in slow, trying to calm the burn in his chest. I said I'd never step foot in there again. His mother gave him a long look, then reached for his hand. Maybe you won't. Maybe you'll own it instead. Jamal let out a small laugh, but it caught in his throat. It wasn't funny. It wasn't a joke. It was a seed, and it had already started to root. That night, Jamal sat on the edge of his childhood bed, his back to the wall and a storm swirling inside him. The injustice wasn't new. It wasn't even shocking. But it was personal, sharp and fresh in a way that stirred something. Deeper than anger. It stirred purpose. He opened his laptop, pulled up the listing agent's contact information he'd saved days ago. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He thought about Doug's smirk, that old man's voice. The shame of being told, again, that he didn't belong. And then he thought of his grandmother's steady hand, her Sunday dresses, her refusal to bow. He began typing. The evening came with a quiet that felt heavier than usual. Jamal sat at the kitchen table long after the food was gone, staring at his untouched glass of tea. The house was still. His mother had turned in early, her door closed, the light underneath flickering once before going dark. He should have felt peace here. Familiar walls, a neighborhood that hadn't changed much, but everything inside him felt unsettled. He looked around at the old photographs on the wall, family reunions, church picnics, birthdays long past, smiling faces, laughter frozen in time. But behind those pictures were years of silence, years of pretending things didn't hurt as much as they did. He pushed the glass away and walked down the hallway toward the guest bedroom. The carpet was still the same, soft, pale brown, worn in the middle from years of pacing. He opened the door and stepped into the room that used to be his. Same twin bed, same desk, same corner shelf with his middle school spelling bee trophy collecting dust. But he wasn't that boy anymore, and still, the pain he felt now was no different from what he felt back then, only deeper. He sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, head hanging low. He had worked hard to leave this behind. Atlanta gave him freedom, respect, space, to build and grow. No one cared about his skin when they saw his spreadsheets, his business proposals, his clean record. But here he was still just you people. It didn't matter that he was educated, that he owned a company, that he was the first in his family to put CEO next to his name. He still wasn't enough for this town, not enough to sit and eat, not enough to be treated like a man. He leaned back slowly, looking at the ceiling. Was it worth it? All this pain just to prove something? Would buying that cafe actually change anything? Or would it just make him a target? He had enough money to walk away, enough pride to justify doing it. Maybe Atlanta was where he belonged after all. He got up and started pacing. He thought about the smirk on Doug's face, the silence in that room, the way no one stood up, no one said a word in his defense. He thought about his mother's warning, how she didn't want to see him broken again. And for a moment, he believed her, believed the fight wasn't worth the cost. He opened the closet and pulled down an old box labeled Grandma Personal. It had been years since he touched it, since he allowed himself to. Inside were books, a crocheted scarf she used to wear on cold Sunday mornings, a pressed flower still tucked inside her Bible. Then he saw the notebook, faded brown leather, edges, soft from use. Her handwriting on the inside cover, delicate but strong. Keep your eyes on the light, even in the dark. Ruthie Rivers. He sat down, opened the first few pages. Grocery lists, sermon notes, prayers for people he barely remembered. And then, about halfway through, a folded piece of paper slipped out. It was old, creased at the edges, yellowing from time. He opened it carefully. The words were handwritten, short and clear. One day, someone will walk in and make this town remember who we are. His hands trembled. He read it again. And again. His breath caught in his throat. She had written it like a prophecy, and somehow she had always known it would be him. The tears came before. He could stop them. Not loud, not messy, just quiet rivers down his face, the kind that carried weight too heavy for words. She had believed in him long before he believed in himself, long before he knew what it meant to carry history on your back. He folded the note and held it against his chest. Maybe the system couldn't be fixed overnight. Maybe this town wouldn't applaud him. Maybe Doug would fight and the stares wouldn't stop. But maybe, just maybe, that cafe didn't belong to them anymore. Maybe it never truly did. He sat for a long time, her words replaying in his mind. When he finally rose to his feet, something inside him had shifted. Not anger, not revenge, conviction. Jamal didn't sleep that night. He stayed in that small room, sitting by the window as the moon climbed and faded. The note rested on his desk, lit by the soft glow of the street lamp outside. The words on that paper had cracked something open in him, something buried under years of survival and quiet tolerance. He thought of all the times he had let things go. In school, when a teacher had mistaken him for a janitor's son during parent night. In college, when a classmate asked if he got in on a scholarship. Even in boardrooms, where his ideas were praised only after someone else repeated them in a different voice. He had learned to smile, to nod, to push forward without making waves. But maybe that's why this cut so deep. Because he'd built his life on proving he belonged in spaces that never intended to make room for him. He rubbed his temples, staring at the glow of his laptop screen. The cafe, the town, the silence. He could leave. No one would blame him. He could close this chapter and never look back. But then what? What would that say to every little boy in this town who looked like him? Every child growing up with dreams just a bit too big for the place they were planted? What would it say about his grandmother's hope? That someone would walk in one day and remind this town of who they were. By morning, he had made a decision. Not out of pride, not out of revenge, but because something bigger was calling him. He picked up the phone and dialed the real estate agent's number listed in the public records. A woman answered, her voice brisk and professional. "Clara Whitman Real Estate, how can I help you?" "Yes, good morning," Jamal said. "I'm calling about the listing on Larson's Cafe." There was a pause. "Are you an investor?" Something like that. "Well," she said, flipping through what sounded like papers. "It's not officially listed on the market yet, but I do represent the property. Who am I speaking with?" "Jamal Rivers." Another pause. Slightly longer this time. "You're local?" "I was. I live in Atlanta now." "I see," she said slowly. "Well, Mr. Rivers, the owner has been hesitant about listing it publicly. He's behind on taxes and payroll, but I believe there's still some pride tied to the name." Jamal's tone sharpened just a little. Even pride needs to pay its bills. Clara chuckled, not unkindly. True enough. I'd like to make an offer, he said. But I want it quiet. For now. That can be arranged. And I don't want the owner knowing my name until the papers are ready. Another pause. Understood. They exchanged contact information and arrangements. The call ended. Jamal sat there, phone still in hand, heart pounding. Not with fear this time, but with fire. It was happening. Not a plan. Not a wish. A move. He stood up, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. The kind that had settled there over years of biting his tongue, lowering his gaze, being the bigger person in a world that never wanted him to grow. He walked to the living room where his mother was reading the paper, her glasses slipping down her nose. She looked up when he entered. "You've been up all night." "I made a call," he said. She set the paper down slowly. "What kind of call?" "To the real estate agent handling Larson's." She sat back in her chair, lips pursed. "I'm making an offer," he continued. She didn't respond right away. She studied his face, the tired eyes, the calm resolve. "Are you sure?" "I wasn't," he admitted. "But then I found something last night. Grandma's journal, and a note she left. She said someone would walk into that place one day and remind this town who we are." His mother's eyes welled up. She blinked, looking away for a second. "She always believed you'd come back for more than a visit." "I didn't know. That's what I was doing," Jamal said. "But now I do." Denise nodded slowly, her voice was quiet. "This town's not easy. I'm not asking it to be," he replied. "I just want to change what I can." She stood and crossed the room, placing a hand on his cheek. "Then do it. Do it with your head high. And don't look back, baby. You walk through that fire. Like you were born for it." He covered her hand with his own, nodded and held her gaze, because he was. It had only been 2 days since Jamal made the call, but everything already felt different. The weight of uncertainty hadn't vanished, but it had shifted, and in its place something else had begun to grow. A question, a possibility, not just for him, but for something bigger. The call came mid-morning. He was sipping coffee in the backyard when his phone buzzed. A name he didn't recognize lit up the screen. "Clara Whitman," he answered, his tone polite but cautious. "Mr. Rivers," the voice on the line began, warm and clear. "This is Clara Whitman. I'm the listing agent on the Larson property." Jamal straightened in his chair. "Yes, I remember." "I was wondering if you might have time today to meet," she said. "There's something I'd like to show you in person. Something you might want to know." Jamal paused. "Is it about the cafe?" Her voice lowered just a bit. "It is, and more than that, really." They agreed on a time. She gave him an address, an office near the edge of town he hadn't been to since childhood. Clara's office was small, tucked between a florist shop and a shuttered barber store. When he walked in, the chime above the door was soft, welcoming. The walls were lined with framed photographs, families posing in front of new homes, old buildings with sold signs in the grass. Clara herself stood behind a wooden desk, straight-backed and composed, with soft white curls pinned up neatly. She wore a pale yellow blouse and silver-rimmed glasses, and when she looked up at him, her eyes held something rare, genuine understanding. "Mr. Rivers," she greeted, standing to shake. His hand. "Thank you for coming." He took her hand, surprised by the firmness in her grip. "Please have a seat," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her. "I've been waiting for someone like you for a long time." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Clara smiled, but it was tinged with something heavier. "I was there that day, at Larson's. I saw how they treated you." Jamal's chest tightened. "You didn't say anything." "I didn't have to," she said gently. "I already knew what they were. I just didn't know what you were planning." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Clara opened a folder on her desk and turned it toward him. "Doug Larson is drowning in debt. Payroll, taxes, insurance, all behind. The cafe is weeks away from being seized, but he's too proud to list. publicly. He thinks a miracle will come walking in. Jamal scanned the figures. They were worse than he imagined. I've been nudging him, she continued. Told him I had a private party interested. Someone who'd pay cash, quick. He didn't ask who. He's that desperate. Jamal leaned back in his chair, the irony hitting him hard. So, let me get this straight, he said. The same man who told me I didn't belong there is now unknowingly accepting an offer? From me? Clara nodded. Poetic, isn't it? Let out a half laugh. It was bitter at first, but then it softened. He shook his head slowly. I don't know whether to be angry or relieved. You can be both, she said. But let me say something, Jamal. She folded her hands in front of her, her voice lowering to something quieter. Older, I marched in Selma. I've been spit on for holding hands with black students outside segregated schools. I've watched progress come slow, then stop, then crawl again. But in all those years, I've learned something. Jamal waited. The fight isn't always loud, sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it looks like you, young, black, successful, and walking into a building they said you'd ever own. He didn't answer right away. He was staring at the papers, the numbers, the history in ink. You could own the very place they say you don't belong, Clara added. Something in Jamal stirred. That same fire from his grandmother's note, from his mother's kitchen, now flickering stronger. For a second he smiled. You make it sound easy. It won't be, she said plainly, but it will be right. Later that evening, long after the office lights had gone out and the town had settled into its evening hush, Jamal drove past the cafe. It was closed. Lights off. Chairs flipped on tables. He parked across the street and stepped out. The night air was cool, brushing against his face as he stood silently, looking at the building. The windows were dark now, but in his mind, he could almost see the ghost of his grandmother sitting in that booth they were never allowed to sit in, smiling gently, like she always knew this moment would come. He walked up to the door, his reflection faint in the glass. He stood there for a long time, saying nothing, thinking everything. This place had taken something from him, from his family, from generations like his, but maybe now it was time to take it back, not with vengeance, with purpose. The next morning came slow and golden, the kind of light that made even tired streets look softer. Jamal sat in the driveway, keys in hand, staring out at the horizon with a mind full of memories, and a heart carrying the weight of something new. His phone buzzed. Clara's voice came through steady and warm. It's done, she said. Doug signed the papers this morning. The property is officially yours. He didn't speak for a moment. Just let the words settle. You still there? She asked gently. I'm here, he finally said. I figured you'd want the keys today. There was a long pause on his end. Yeah, I would. An hour later, they stood face to face in front of the cafe. The street was quiet. Only the sound of wind brushing through trees and the occasional hum of a car passing by. Clara held the small silver key in her palm like it was something sacred. Her fingers closed around it once more before offering it to him. I've sold houses, businesses, and land for 40 years, she said, looking him in the eye. But this is the first time it's felt like justice. Jamal reached out slowly, taking the key from her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, and for a second, they both held on. I don't want revenge, he said quietly. I just want to build something better. I know, she nodded. That's why it had to be you. He looked down at the key. It wasn't heavy, but it felt like it held generations. Clara stepped back, tears starting to gather at the corners of her eyes. Burn the hate with love, she said. Let them see who we really are. Jamal didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was tight, his heart full. He turned slowly and stepped up to the front door. The same door that had once kept his family outside. The same one that told him he didn't belong. He unlocked it. The latch clicked. The door opened, and just like that, something shifted, not just for him, but for everyone who ever walked past that place and felt invisible. He stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath his feet. The air smelled like old grease and stale sugar. The walls were yellowed, the counter still sticky with memories. But he didn't see decay. He saw potential. He saw tables filled with all kinds of faces. He saw music playing, art from local kids on the walls, smiles that weren't forced, eyes that didn't look through you. He saw healing. He turned back to the door and stood there in silence just like he had the night before. But this time he wasn't on the outside. He was home. The morning air held a quiet tension, as if the town itself knew something was about to shift. Inside the cafe, Jamal stood behind the counter, his hands steady but his heart pacing. The room was cleaner now, walls scrubbed, windows wiped, and the smell of fresh paint in the air. The old signs were gone. A new one leaned near the door, still waiting to be mounted. Rivers and Cormer Cafe. This wasn't just a name. It was a declaration. The sound of the front door swinging open broke the silence. Doug Larson stood in the entrance, eyes narrowed, shoulders tight. He scanned the space, his space, like it had been invaded. He wore the same faded flannel shirt and a look that was more worn than his boots. He didn't say hello. He just stared at Jamal, who looked back with calm. Doug walked in slowly, jaw clenched. "I came to get my stuff." "It's all in the back," Jamal replied, voice steady. Doug didn't move. His eyes swept over the changes. The old photographs taken down, the walls lighter, the atmosphere no longer suffocating. Then he stepped forward. "This was my father's place," he said, voice cracking under the weight of something more than anger. "You think you can just walk in here and erase us?" Jamal didn't flinch. "I'm not erasing anyone," he said. "I'm building something better, for everyone." Doug laughed, sharp, bitter, and broken. "Everyone? That's a nice word until people like me get left out." "No one's being left out," Jamal said. "But you can't keep the doors closed and expect to call it community." Doug's hands were shaking now. He paced in front of the counter, like a caged animal. "My father served this town for 40 years, Jamal nodded. "And for 40 years he served only the ones who looked like him. You don't get it." "I do," Jamal replied, voice rising just slightly. "More than you think." There was a long pause. "You don't belong here," Doug said. But the words came out weak, like even he no longer believed them. Jamal looked him dead in the eye. "I do now." Doug stared at him for a moment longer, then turned away, fists clenched. His pride had taken its final breath. He stormed into the back without another word. Jamal stood alone again, but the silence didn't feel the same. It felt earned. The next morning, the sun rose slow and golden over Main Street, casting long shadows over faded brick and cracked sidewalks. But something about the day felt new, alive, as if the air itself had shifted. Word had spread overnight, quietly at first, then quickly, like small-town gossip always did. Jamal Rivers was opening the old Larson's Cafe, but it wasn't Larson's anymore. The sign above the door had changed. Bold, simple, and proud, Rivers and Comer Cafe. The windows sparkled. Inside, the tables were neatly arranged, each with a small card that read, "Welcome. All are served here." And on the walls? Not the old black and white photos of town parades with missing faces. Now, there were portraits of black educators, local musicians, war veterans, pastors, and business owners, people who had built this town's spirit, but were never offered a seat at the table. That morning, the cafe doors opened not with fanfare, but with intention. The smell of fresh biscuits and brewed coffee drifted into the street. Jamal stood behind the counter, his shirt pressed, his expression calm. Beside him were two young servers, one black, one white, both nervous, both proud. The first guest walked in. Mrs. Carter, a retired teacher who had taught Jamal in 5th grade. She smiled, eyes wet with memory. Then came two teenage boys from the neighborhood, both surprised to see a menu that welcomed them, then a mother with a toddler, then a mixed-race couple who had always avoided this part of town. Each person who entered saw something unfamiliar, warmth in a place that had once been cold, and none of them had to ask if they were welcome. They already knew. The sound of the front door swinging open broke the silence. Doug Larson stood in the entrance, eyes narrowed, shoulders tight. He scanned the space, his space, like it had been invaded. He wore the same faded flannel shirt and a look that was more worn than his boots. He didn't say hello. He just stared at Jamal, who looked back with calm. Doug walked in slowly, jaw clenched. "I came to get my stuff." "It's all in the back," Jamal replied, voice steady. Doug didn't move. His eyes swept over the changes, the old photographs taken down, the walls lighter, the atmosphere no longer suffocating. Then he stepped forward. "This was my father's place," he said, voice cracking under the weight of something more than anger. "You think you can just walk in here and erase us?" Jamal didn't flinch. "I'm not erasing anyone," he said. "I'm building something better, for everyone." Doug laughed, sharp, bitter, and broken. "Everyone? That's a nice word until people like me get left out." "No one's being left out," Jamal said. "But you can't keep the doors closed and expect to call it community." Doug's hands were shaking now. He paced in front of the counter, like a caged animal. "My father served this town for 40 years, Jamal nodded. "And for 40 years he served only the ones who looked like him. You don't get it." "I do," Jamal replied, voice rising just slightly. "More than you think." There was a long pause. "You don't belong here," Doug said. But the words came out weak, like even he no longer believed them. Jamal looked him dead in the eye. "I do now." Doug stared at him for a moment longer, then turned away, fists clenched. His pride had taken its final breath. He stormed into the back without another word. Jamal stood alone again, but the silence didn't feel the same. It felt earned. The next morning, the sun rose slow and golden over Main Street, casting long shadows over faded brick and cracked sidewalks. But something about the day felt new, alive, as if the air itself had shifted. Word had spread overnight, quietly at first, then quickly, like small-town gossip always did. Jamal Rivers was opening the old Larson's Cafe, but it wasn't Larson's anymore. The sign above the door had changed. Bold, simple, and proud, Rivers and Comer Cafe. The windows sparkled. Inside, the tables were neatly arranged, each with a small card that read, "Welcome. All are served here." And on the walls? Not the old black and white photos of town parades with missing faces. Now, there were portraits of black educators, local musicians, war veterans, pastors, and business owners, people who had built this town's spirit, but were never offered a seat at the table. That morning, the cafe doors opened not with fanfare, but with intention. The smell of fresh biscuits and brewed coffee drifted into the street. Jamal stood behind the counter, his shirt pressed, his expression calm. Beside him were two young servers, one black, one white, both nervous, both proud. The first guest walked in. Mrs. Carter, a retired teacher who had taught Jamal in 5th grade. She smiled, eyes wet with memory. Then came two teenage boys from the neighborhood, both surprised to see a menu that welcomed them, then a mother with a toddler, then a mixed-race couple who had always avoided this part of town. Each person who entered saw something unfamiliar, warmth in a place that had once been cold, and none of them had to ask if they were welcome. They already knew. Breakfast was free that day. Jamal had decided that himself. It wasn't a promotion, it was a statement. Outside, cars slowed, people stared, and standing on the opposite sidewalk, tucked into the shadows near the hardware store, was Doug Larson. He didn't move. He just watched as people filled a space that once belonged to him. Watched as laughter echoed from booths that had once sat empty when the wrong people walked in. Watched as the building came alive in a way it never had under his father's name. His jaw was tight, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. But the truth was right there, written in the crowd. They hadn't pushed him out. He had chosen not to walk in, and for the first time in his life, Doug Larson was the one left standing outside, not by force, but by his own refusal to change. Inside, Jamal noticed him. He didn't wave, he didn't nod. He just kept working, serving plates, refilling cups, smiling at children. He had already made his stand, not with shouting, not with revenge, but with grace. With breakfast, with belonging. The sun was beginning to set on Jamal's third day as the owner of Rivers and Comber Cafe. The hum of conversation had quieted. The morning rush had faded into late afternoon calm, and for the first time since the doors opened, he found a moment to breathe. He stood behind the counter, a towel in his hand, slowly wiping the surface. Even though it was already clean, the cafe had changed, yes, but so had he. 3 days ago, he'd walked into this building feeling like an outsider. 3 days ago, he was humiliated, pushed out, made to feel small in a place that had never wanted him to feel big. And now? Now he stood at the center of it all. He didn't need applause. He didn't need every heart to change overnight. But the silence that once screamed rejection now echoed with quiet acceptance. He glanced toward the wall behind the counter. A frame hung there now. Modest brown wood, aged but polished. Inside it, the note his grandmother had written years ago. One day someone will walk in and make this town remember who we are. He read it every morning before opening. Not to remind himself of what he had to prove, but to remember who he already was. The bell above the door jingled again. A woman walked in, mid-30s maybe. Nervous, shoulders slightly hunched, holding the hand of a small boy no older than 7. They stood near the entrance, scanning the room. The woman's eyes landed on Jamal, and for a split second he saw hesitation, but the boy tugged at her. "And I like this place," the boy said, his voice high and sincere. "It feels good in here." She looked down at him, then back at Jamal. Her lips parted like she was about to say something, maybe an apology, maybe nothing at all. Instead, she walked to a booth and sat down. Jamal smiled softly and grabbed 2 menus. That moment stayed with him, not because the boy had said something poetic, but because it was real, simple, honest. You didn't need speeches to start change. Sometimes all it took was comfort in a space that used to hold tension. As the evening settled, Jamal locked the door and turned the sign to "closed." The street outside was mostly empty now. A few porch lights flickered on in the distance, and somewhere a dog barked faintly. The day was done, but something much deeper was just beginning. He moved slowly through the cafe, wiping down tables, pushing in chairs, setting each thing back in place. It was a ritual that felt more like reverence. Not just for the space, but for what it now stood for. This place used to echo with silence, the kind that said, "You're not welcome here." Now it echoed with laughter, with conversation, with children asking for extra syrup and old men staying longer than they needed to, just to sit and feel part of something. Not everyone had changed. Some still walked past with narrowed eyes. Some still said nothing at all. But Jamal wasn't looking for their approval. He never was. He was looking for truth, and in just 72 hours he had found it. It wasn't about owning a building, it was about owning his voice, his presence, his right to take up space in a town that had once hoped he'd disappear quietly. He stood in front of the framed note again, reading his grandmother's words one last time before switching off the lights. One day, someone will walk in and make this town remember who we are. He whispered to the frame, "I hope I did that, Grandma." Then he turned to the window and looked out onto the quiet street. A few kids were riding bikes. An older couple walked their dog, and Doug Larson sat across the street on a bench, alone. Staring down at his shoes, Jamal didn't wave. He didn't gloat. He simply watched, because some victories don't need noise. Some revolutions happen quietly, in the gentle way a space opens, in the warmth of welcome, in the refusal to return hate with hate. He stepped outside, pulled the door closed behind him, and locked it. As he walked down the sidewalk, a voice echoed in his mind. Not Doug's, not the men who doubted him, but his own. Strong, clear. Sure, you don't change people by shouting. You change them by showing them the light and letting them walk toward it.